In this video, we're going to take a look at Lamy Crystal Rhodonite. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This pink can shade. Now, it can, but it doesn't need to. Its tone on the page definitely stands out. It's not so light you can barely read it, and it's still gentle. Very interesting, especially since going into Lamy inks, I can generally expect to not love the ink, but I love the performance here. So this is two in their Crystal series that really did well so far. I like how simple and gentle it comes across to deliver any message that you would be writing. So to grade a paper and use this is a little surprising to students as a color in an ink from someone that looks like me. But they also look at it and don't get offended by it like they do red sometimes. So using this in the classroom could be a very good thing for me. Now, I don't know that I would seek out a bottle of this to write tons with. I don't think this is bad, but I already have a bottle of a pink ink that does very well, and I just don't use pink enough to have two bottles. Now, if you're someone that does get multiple bottles of pink, then this might be one of those inks that you would look at a bottle for, because its performance is really good. I have to add this again, or for the first time, the swatch is going to lie. You're going to see a lot of sheen, and we're not going to see a lot of sheen. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Sailor 1911 large with a zoom nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get quite a few spots of shading throughout a bunch of this, especially when you get to the end of the first line with heretical, or the word nature, or the word ideas all on the second line there. It really starts looking with more personality than just a dull pink. I was, again, quite taken back by how well this ink did. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. It shades very well, and I love how easy it is to read. It's not painful on my eyes at all, and I always enjoy when I find a pink that isn't screaming obnoxious, and this is not. The broad nib is about the same tone, maybe slightly darker than the medium, with no feather, no spread, really good shading. I think it shades the best of all of them on the page here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get almost no ghosting and definitely no bleeding. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with A Hero 7035 with a fine nib. A D-like Alpha with a medium nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, almost no shading. The absorbent nature of this paper has eaten it up, but we do get a very solid pink, even on top of this toned paper. So this is doing very nice here. It's really an energetic tone to look at with this pink. The medium is much darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread. It definitely has some spots of shading coming through, which I think look pretty good. I'm very impressed with how it's looking and how it's performing in general, and especially on this paper that hasn't been doing as well. The broad nib has no feather, no spread. Yes, it is shading. It's doing very well at giving the very light pink tones all the way to a very dark pink, almost making you think of a red, but definitely not a red. So, very well done as a pink. Looking at the back of the page, we see very minor ghosting and we get no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We get a few moments of shading. I think we get a little bit more shading here than we did on the Leuchtterm. Not as good as we did with the Clairfontaine, both of which can be expected. On this cream tone paper, it is definitely keeping a very nice crisp line that's easy to read with this pink ink. And anytime we have that, it's an extra win because it's like finding yellows that are done very well. It's difficult. The medium nib is slightly lighter than the fine, with no feather, no spread. It does have more shading than the fine does, which makes sense since it's coming across a little bit lighter in tone. While it is lighter in tone, it's never too light to have any kind of a problem. And even with the cream color background, it's easy to read and tell it's a pink. The broad nib is just a little bit darker than the medium, not, well, probably right about the same as the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it's shading very well. What a good combination, this ink and paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a lighter tone than we've had with the other papers, which we should have come to expect at this point on this paper. Now, there's no feather and there's no spread, and there is a couple moments of shading that happen, but just slightly. The medium nib is about the same tone as the fine, but I do think it's a little easier to read than the fine is, and that's because of the thicker lines naturally in the writing. It has no feather, it has no spread. It does have a couple of moments of shading that, if you look at the word intimidated, the TIM is a bit darker than the rest of the word. If you look at the word against, the ST is a bit darker than the rest of the word. So it's decent here, especially considering this paper. Now, the broad nib is a little bit darker than the medium or fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has a couple moments of shading. I think the moments of shading on the broad are easier to stand out through their darker spots, but it's not like it's shading in and out a whole lot. It's more like you get a dark side of a letter. Looking at the back of the page, we get very minimal ghosting, and we get no bleeding that touches the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Caran d'Ache Divine Pink. Here is Diamine Pink Glitz. Here is Krishna Bohemia. Here is Private Reserve Rose Rage. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, no shading, but it maintains being a very nice, solid pink that's not difficult to read. Often teachers don't like students using pink and green inks, and that's because the tones students choose are very difficult to read. If a student chose this, I'd have no problem because I would find it easy to read. Plus, I think it would be kind of interesting to see math work done in pink. Looking at the medium nib, it's a little bit lighter than the fine with no feather, no spread. There are a couple of moments of shading where you see things overlapping themselves. The Y of finery and the F of feather, where those are crossing, you definitely see it does get darker. So it's capable, it's just not really coming through very much. The broad nib is a little bit darker than the medium with no feather, no spread, no shade whatsoever. It is just being a solid performing deep pink in this case. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and we get no bleeding that touches the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Califolio Ultramarine Blue. Here is a green ink by Diamine, their Classic Green. Here's a turquoise ink by Noodlers, their Turquoise Eel, a lubricated ink. Here is a purple ink by Private Reserve, their Tanzanite Fast Dry. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get minor feathers, really minor, barely worth mentioning, although I've already mentioned them. We do get a bit of spread, but it's very manageable here. We don't really get much shading, but considering how well this is doing on this paper, I'm not worried about the shade here. Now the medium is about the same tone as the fine. It does have tiny feathers, again, barely worth mentioning, but they are kind of there. Not a big deal, not something that should stop you from using this ink on this paper. There's the slightest bit of spread, again, not a big deal. There's no shading, just a good solid pink tone. The broad nib is just a bit darker than the medium or the fine. It does have some tiny feathers in it. It does have a little bit of spread that's going on. It also does have a little bit of shading coming through. Look at the word with and you'll see it. It's just not very stand out here, but there is some. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we got no bleed through that touched the page underneath. Looking at the back of the writing, we barely get any ghosting, which means this is a very good ink to use on cheap paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? When I was choosing a pen, I really, honestly, wanted to be able to go with a fine pen because I think this writing would look very good with a nice fine. But in the writing samples, the medium looked good. So I went with a medium flow fine because I think it's going to darken the letters just enough to make them really look good. Outstanding, even from a wet fine pen, even though in the writing it's the medium that I preferred the most. I may also go with a medium flow medium, which is what I was using during these testings. But I won't be going with a zoom nib anytime future for this ink. Thanks for watching.